For most of human history, money did not exist, which sounds peaceful until one imagines trying to trade half a cow for a basket of onions without starting an argument. This is the small but persistent mystery. At the heart of early economies, humans were clever enough to farm, hunt, and organize villages, yet somehow spent thousands of years stuck negotiating like people at a flea market with no small bills. The earliest societies ran on barter, a system built on direct exchange, mutual need, and an impressive tolerance for inconvenience. If one person had fish and wanted grain, and another had grain but wanted pottery, instead trade stalled. Everyone learned quickly that value was subjective, timing was everything, and coincidence was rare. Mesopotamia around 9000 BCE shows early systems of exchange tied closely to agriculture. Grain, livestock, and labor became units of value, but they were terrible at behaving like money. Goats wandered off grain spoiled, and labor could not be stored for later. Still, barter worked just well enough to keep villages alive, which is often the most dangerous level of success. It delays better solutions. As settlements grew into towns and towns into cities, the limits of barter became obvious. Long-distance trade expanded temples and palaces, needed reliable accounting, and debts began to outlive the people who owed them. By around 3000 BCE, Sumerian city-states had developed complex credit systems using barley and silver as standard measures, even when no physical exchange occurred. These were not coins yet, but abstract units written into clay tablets by scribes with excellent handwriting and infinite patience. The important shift was conceptual value no longer had to sit in your hands to be real. It could exist as a promise, a measurement and agreement shared by a community. Money had not been invented, but the idea that value could be standardized, tracked, and trusted was quietly taking shape, probably without anyone throwing a celebration. Once people agreed that value could be measured, the next question was, what exactly should do the measuring? Grain-rotted animals escaped, and promises, while useful, had a habit of being forgotten at inconvenient moments. Metals solved many of these problems almost accidentally. They were durable, divisible, and most importantly, annoying to fake. By around 2500 BCE, silver by weight had become a common reference in Mesopotamia, even though no one was yet carrying silver coins in their pockets. Merchants used balances and standardized weights, turning trade into something that looked suspiciously like math. The real breakthrough came much later, around the 7th century BCE, in the Kingdom of Lydia, located in what is now Western Turkey. Their rulers began stamping pieces of electrum, a natural alloy of gold and silver, with official symbols. These early coins did something revolutionary. They shifted trust from personal relationships to public authority. You no longer needed to know the merchant, the temple, or the story behind the metal. The stamp did the talking. It said, in effect, this is worth something because we say so, and we are powerful enough to make that statement stick. Coins spread rapidly across the Greek world and beyond. Athens minted silver drachmas. Rome perfected mass production of coinage, and soldiers began to expect regular pay rather than vague promises of future loot. Coinage reshaped politics as much as commerce. Taxes became easier to collect, armies easier to fund, and empires easier to manage from a distance. Of course, rulers also discovered that reducing the metal content of coins was an excellent way to fund wars quietly, a habit that caused inflation, public outrage, and the occasional assassination. Still, metal money endured, because it balanced something rare in human history: convenience and trust. It was heavy enough to feel real, official enough to feel safe, and standardized enough to move smoothly across borders. At least until someone started shaving the edges. Metal coins ruled for centuries. But they had one persistent flaw. They were heavy, especially when your economy became ambitious. Carrying large sums of silver across mountains or oceans was less a financial strategy and more an upper body workout. The solution emerged not from kings but from merchants. In China during the Tang and Song dynasties between the 7th and 11th centuries, traders began using paper receipts issued by deposit shops. These slips of paper represented coins stored safely elsewhere, and astonishingly, people trusted them. The idea that money could be light, portable, and mostly imaginary had arrived. Governments, always alert to useful ideas they did not invent, quickly stepped in. By the 11th century, the Song dynasty issued the world's first state-backed paper money. This was not a symbolic gesture. It was an economic gamble on trust printing and administrative competence. When managed carefully, paper money worked beautifully. Trade expanded, taxes flowed, and markets became faster and more flexible. When overused, it collapsed just as efficiently, proving that inflation was not a modern invention, but an old human habit: wearing new clothes. Paper money traveled west much more slowly. Medieval Europe remained attached to metal, partly out of tradition, and partly out of deep suspicion that value should weigh something. Still, banking quietly evolved. Italian city-states like Florence and Venice developed bills of exchange in the 13th and 14th centuries, allowing merchants to move value across borders without moving gold. Banks emerged as professional trust managers, keeping records, issuing loans, and occasionally failing in dramatic fashion. By the 17th century, governments began issuing banknotes backed by reserves of gold or silver, blending state authority with banking practice. The promise was simple: this paper could always be exchanged for real metal. Most of the time this was true, which was enough. Paper money succeeded not because it was honest, but because it was believable. And belief turned out to be a remarkably strong economic force. By the 20th century, money completed its quiet transformation from something you could drop on your foot to something that mostly lived in ledgers. Wars, depressions, and global trade strained the old promise that paper money could always be exchanged for gold. In 1971, the United States formally ended that promise, severing the last major link between everyday currency and precious metal. From that moment on, most of the world ran on fiat money currency, valuable not because of what it could be exchanged for, but because governments, institutions, and entire populations agreed to behave as if it mattered. Remarkably, this worked. The late 20th and early 21st centuries then did something even stranger. Money began disappearing from sight. Credit cards, electronic transfers, and online banking reduced coins and bills to background props. Value became a series of numbers moving at the speed of light, approved by algorithms rather than clerks. A cup of coffee could now be paid for by tapping a piece of plastic or a glowing rectangle, a process that feels less like spending and more like politely informing a machine that you exist. This invisibility changed behavior. Spending felt easier, saving felt abstract, and debt became something people carried without weight or sound. At the same time, financial power concentrated in systems few individuals fully understood. Fortunes shifted overnight, and money began acting less like a tool and more like weather, predictable in patterns, chaotic in moments, Then came digital currencies and cryptocurrencies, attempting to remove governments from the equation entirely. Using cryptography and decentralized networks, they promised trust without authority rules, without rulers. Whether they represent the future of money or a fascinating detour remains unclear. What is clear is that money has always been less about objects and more about agreements. From cattle to coins to code, its true form has been collective belief, constantly renegotiated, endlessly human, and never quite finished evolving.